Right up front, this review gets into some pretty heavy psychological horror subject matter and a fair amount of gore, so if you're easily disturbed by that sort of thing, my video on Goat Simulator is a little bit more lighthearted, and it'll probably make you laugh. Also, this review contains no major plot spoilers. With that out of the way, there have been a good handful of games based in some way on H.P. Lovecraft's cosmic horror mythos over the years. I've tried most of them, and I can say without hesitation that 2018's Call of Cthulhu by Sanity Studios and published by Focus is probably one of the best. In order to understand what you're looking at in the footage, it's important to know up front that this is kind of a combination of different game styles. I would define it as a multi-story choose-your-own-adventure book inside of a survival game inside of a mystery novel. It can be a little slow-paced, but it'll still raise your pulse in more than a few places. Or maybe it won't. Well, the game's basic concept is loosely based on the pen-and-paper tabletop Call of Cthulhu role-playing game, and your character, the private detective Edward Pierce, has attributes in a few different categories that you can put points into as you progress, and two of them, medicine and occult, which level up based entirely on finding secret clues and hidden items. For example, finding and reading a book on anatomy will give you a small boost to your medicine skill. Now, the core gameplay boils down to 5 different game mechanics: investigation, conversation, maintaining, or giving up on, your sanity, stealth, and combat. It should be mentioned early on that combat is a very small part of this game. You don't even really get a weapon until pretty late into the plot, and combat only factors into a couple of scenes. Now, the combat you do engage in ends up being pretty simplistic. This is not a first-person shooter. The most critical gameplay mechanics are the investigation and conversation elements. You combine these two and basically try to find clues to unravel the mystery that you're hired to investigate, with different clues or conversational choices opening up different plot directions, and potentially having deleterious influences on your mental faculties. And to be clear on that point, the game has branching paths along a general plot direction and multiple endings which are completely different from each other. It absolutely is worth giving the game at least a second playthrough after completing it once, just to explore different plot choices, or take the opposite path with Edward Pierce's sanity. The sanity mechanic is worth some special mention. Now, throughout the game, you encounter a fairly high quantity of occult rituals, questionable medical practices, gore, and corruption. Trying to maintain Pierce's sanity throughout all of that is honestly a bit of a challenge, at least it was for me. But you can also take the opposite approach and just dive head first into the madness, a direction that opens up some unique conversational options and some strange plot elements. My first playthrough, I made the choice not to deliberately try to keep or lose Pierce's sanity and just let things develop organically. I wasn't let down. Now, the conversational gameplay mechanic, it's important to know that only some conversations give you the chance to go back and, for example, ask all of the questions that you're first presented with. In a lot of the interactions, the conversation flows and develops, so you absolutely can and will miss clues and lock yourself out of plot developments. This makes the game a bit more dynamic than similar titles, and in Call of Cthulhu, seemingly minor dialogue choices can have some pretty long-lasting impacts on your playthrough. The same thing goes for clues that you find in the environment. If you miss something important, it's missed. And speaking of the clues, the game also features some fairly unique reconstruction scenes. Edward Pierce, the main character, is a private investigator after all, so it's a fairly common thing to find yourself in an important scene. For example, a room where, some major event happened. And then you have to complete a little bit of like an imagination creativity sequence trying to piece together what actually happened based on the clues and evidence you find around the room. Keep in mind that your scores in the different attributes, like investigation and psychology, can impact your ability to figure out, what the clues and dialogue options are really meaning. And it can also impact what clues and dialogue options are available to begin with. Really, it's pretty dynamic. Despite the cinematic feel of the game and the overall presentation, you are not just watching a movie. It's very interactive. And speaking of which, Call of Cthulhu also makes generous use of pretty decently rendered cinematic cutscenes to advance the plot, show flashbacks, and that sort of a thing. The level of detail is pretty high, the art style is solid, and they did a really good job of adding in little details here and there to whisper subtle hints at the overall plot arc without really giving away too much in advance. And that brings us to the plot. If you don't know anything about the H.P. Lovecraft mythology, a lot of the game's plot will be pretty fresh. And if you're new to it, or, if you only have a passing familiarity, you'll appreciate some of the careful nods to, obscure bits of the mythos that you might have encountered, while still being surprised and shocked in more than a few places. Now, if you're one of those folks who can correctly spell and pronounce the names of all the great old ones, the plot is going to be very familiar to you, but I still think you'll enjoy it. If nothing else, it'll be a huge fan service to the big mega fans out there. I'm personally somewhere around the second option. I'm generally a fan of the cosmic horror genre, and I have a casual familiarity with Lovecraft, but I've read less than a third of his material. And coming from that kind of a starting point, I really enjoyed the story in Call of Cthulhu, especially the multiple endings. My goodness, it was well done. It's disturbing and hideous in just the right amount, while the mystery and character backgrounds keep you guessing and second guessing what's really happening. They balanced it all out very well, and on the whole, the plot is just excellent. So, what didn't I like? Well, a few things, actually. First, the stealth scenes. Now, there are a few scenes with stealth mechanics where you have to sneak around and avoid getting caught by various NPCs. I promised no major spoilers. And personally, I didn't really care for the sneaking stealth scenes at all. The stealth infiltration genre never really did much for me, and I honestly can't say if the stealth scenes in Call of Cthulhu are well done or not. I just don't like them. But I don't really dig 3D stealth games generally, so I don't know. If that's your thing, it's here. And if it's not your thing, you only have to suffer through it a couple of times. Also, there are a few sequences that kind of put you in a situation without any direction whatsoever, no clear objective, no goal, and just some random stuff in the environment that you can interact with. You get no indication how to advance the scene, and I can't even describe those bits as being a puzzle, because it's just so unclear what you're actually trying to accomplish that figuring out what the goal of the scene is ends up being the puzzle. Now, there are only a couple of parts like that, and they're not bad, just tedious. And in one undirected puzzle scene in particular, you're faced with a scenario that can get you killed, but it's entirely unclear if you're supposed to run, hide, sneak, wait, fight, or what. And if you fight, what do you fight with? Not bad, not annoying, and not frustrating, but definitely tedious. The silver lining is, just like the stealth bits, you only have to complete a couple of those. My last criticism is that a lot of the minor characters aren't really visually distinct. It's a minor gripe, but later in the game I found myself unable to remember if a guy that I needed to interact with was the guy from one part or the guy from a different part. The overall visual style is great, but a few of the secondary characters, they could almost be clones or like palette swaps. So, is it fun? I think so. The actual gameplay is, as I mentioned before, mostly slow-paced, but it does have some scenes that'll test your reaction time. The overall plot is excellent, and I think the story is well presented given the medium of a game like this. However, if you just don't have any interest in the subject matter, if you're overly squeamish to, the gore or horror content, or if the psychological elements of the game are just a bit too disturbing and no judgments, this might not be the game for you. On the other hand, if you like investigation and like dialogue-driven plot sequences, if you enjoy the exploration or like the visual storytelling concept, solving mysteries, or if you're just looking for an opportunity to surrender yourself to the depths of forbidden truths that we were never intended to contemplate, you'll definitely get something out of Call of Cthulhu. And who knows, maybe you'll even lose a little bit too. As always, thanks for watching.